Imagine you are holding your phone. Look at it for a second, not at the screen, but at the object itself. The battery inside that device almost certainly contains cobalt. The wiring connecting its components runs on copper. The connectors keeping it stable depend on refined metals pulled from the ground by human hands, in conditions most of the people reading about the clean energy revolution have never seen and would prefer not to think about. Now imagine that tomorrow, the supply chain delivering those materials stops, not slows down, stops. Your screen does not just get more expensive, it becomes scarce. Repairs take longer. New devices stall. The data centers training the AI systems that everyone is racing to build do not run on ambition, they run on metal, wiring, and industrial inputs. And when those inputs tighten, the revolution bottlenecks. The device in your hand is already a participant in a war. You just were not told you had enlisted. China, Russia, and the United States are locked in the most consequential strategic competition of the 21st century. Not over ideology, not over trade deficits or currency exchange rates, over the physical building blocks of the future, the cobalt, copper, lithium, rare earth elements, and uranium deposits concentrated in one part of the world above all others. Africa. The continent holds roughly 30% of the world's known critical mineral reserves. The Democratic Republic of Congo alone supplies close to 70% of the world's mined cobalt. Guinea sits on the largest known bauxite deposits on Earth. Zimbabwe hosts some of the largest hard rock lithium projects currently in development anywhere. And the International Energy Agency has estimated that if global climate targets are to be met, demand for the critical mineral inputs required to build batteries, motors, and power systems must increase by roughly 6 times current levels. For specific battery materials like lithium, cobalt, and nickel, demand growth could exceed 20 to 30 times by around 2040. This is the arithmetic of the new scramble for Africa. And the original one was brutal enough that it still defines the politics of the continent today. In 1884, European powers gathered in Berlin and divided a continent they did not own. No African representatives were present. Borders were drawn in ink, backed by rifles. The motivation was the Industrial Revolution's appetite for rubber, palm oil, cotton, and minerals. The Maxim gun was the enforcement mechanism. The ideology was a civilizing mission. The reality was extraction, documented in some cases by atrocities so severe they entered the historical record as warnings about what human beings do when profit is placed above accountability. 140 years later, the players have better public relations. But what has changed, and what has not, is the central question animating every mining contract, infrastructure loan, and security agreement being signed across the continent right now. China saw this coming long before anyone else was paying attention. While the United States was absorbing the consequences of 2-decade-long military campaigns in the Middle East, Beijing was doing something quieter and ultimately more consequential. It was building infrastructure. The Angola model, offering oil-backed construction loans with no political conditions attached, became the template for what eventually scaled into the Belt and Road Initiative. China built the Addis Ababa to Djibouti Railway. It built the Mombasa to Nairobi standard gauge line. It built ports, power plants, parliament buildings, and hospitals. The financing was structured so that Chinese companies did the construction work, Chinese banks fronted the capital, and repayment flowed back in commodities or export revenues tied to the projects. Critics in the West labeled this debt trap diplomacy, conjuring images of China seizing airports and ports the moment a country missed a payment. The reality is more subtle and ultimately more durable. China does not need to own an asset to control its flow. When you build the road, finance the dam, and own the shipping company that carries the ore to your refineries, you control the pipeline. Ownership is optional when you control the logistics. The result is that China today dominates not just the extraction side of the critical mineral supply chain, but the processing stage, the step that actually determines where the value lands. China processes somewhere between 85 and 90% of the world's rare earth elements and controls the majority of global lithium and cobalt refining capacity. It does not merely own dirt, it owns the choke points through which everyone else's dirt must pass. No single transaction illustrates the strategic stakes of this more starkly than what happened in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2016. The Tenke-Fungurume mine in the DRC is one of the world's premier copper-cobalt deposits, an industrial-scale asset sitting in the heart of a country that supplies the majority of the world's mined cobalt. The company that held the stake, facing severe debt pressure, needed to raise cash quickly. It agreed to sell its interest to a Chinese mining company for more than $2.5 billion. Washington did not intervene. The sale was reviewed and cleared, and a crown jewel of the cobalt supply chain moved deeper into the Chinese orbit at precisely the moment the battery economy began accelerating. By most independent analyses and US congressional assessments, Chinese companies hold ownership stakes, partial or majority, in the majority of the DRC's major industrial cobalt and copper-cobalt mining assets. China does not control the country. But when you turn the valve on global cobalt supply, Beijing hears the water move. Underneath the industrial mining operations, a parallel and darker layer of the supply chain persists. Artisanal mining, small-scale, informal, hand-dug accounts for a meaningful share of cobalt production, with estimates typically ranging between 10 and 20%, depending on price conditions and enforcement. The conditions in these operations have been extensively documented by human rights organizations and journalists. Narrow tunnels dug without structural support, no safety equipment, no medical coverage, children present in the broader ecosystem, men crawling into hand-carved shafts that can collapse with no rescue infrastructure waiting above. When a company sources cobalt without rigorous traceability systems, and many have, ore from these operations can enter the broader supply chain and eventually power a battery marketed as part of a clean future. The irony is not subtle. The green energy revolution, sold as a moral upgrade for the planet, has supply chain routes that do not survive close inspection. Russia's entry into this competition operates on entirely different logic. Where China builds, Russia protects. And the protection is offered explicitly in exchange for access. For decades, France served as the de facto security guarantor across the Sahel, the strip of semi-arid land stretching across West Africa below the Sahara. French troops spent years fighting Islamist insurgencies across Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The mission dragged on. Violence persisted. Public patience in these countries collapsed. Governments fell. And one by one, leaders across the Sahel decided they wanted the French gone. Russia was ready with a replacement offer that made no pretense of long-term development. The pitch was blunt. We will provide armed personnel, helicopter gunships, and protection for your government against its enemies. In return, we want access. Goldfields in Sudan, diamonds and mining concessions in the Central African Republic, uranium-adjacent influence in Niger. The mercenary organization that delivered this service rebranded after its founder's death in a suspicious plane crash, but operationally continuous has embedded itself across multiple Sahelian governments as a protection racket operating at continental scale. Niger makes the stakes concrete. The country has long been one of France's primary uranium suppliers, historically providing somewhere around 15 to 20% of the uranium, feeding France's nuclear fleet, which generates approximately 70% of French electricity. When Niger's military government expelled French forces and began warming to Russian security relationships, it was not simply a political embarrassment. It was a signal that a critical supply chain for European energy had entered contested territory. Russia does not need to own Niger's uranium mines to matter. It needs only to make European energy planners nervous. Uncertainty itself is leverage. The civilian cost of this arrangement is documented and grim. Independent conflict tracking data shows that in multiple countries where Russian military personnel have replaced French forces, civilian deaths have not decreased. In some regions they have risen. The mercenaries are not deployed to protect populations. They are deployed to protect palaces. For a government facing an armed coup, that is the only metric that matters. It is a protection racket operating across borders, and businesses expanding. Into this contest, the United States arrived late, underfunded, and bureaucratically disadvantaged. The West's most serious hard asset response to China's infrastructure dominance is what has become known as the Lobito Corridor, a major rail and port project designed to connect the Atlantic coast of Angola to the mineral heartlands of the DRC and Zambia. The strategic logic is clear. Create a westward-facing export route for copper and cobalt that does not depend on the most China-aligned transit infrastructure on the eastern side of the continent. The US and its G7 partners have committed several $1 billion to the project. The intention is real, but the American way of doing infrastructure financing moves at a pace that creates problems in a race where speed matters. A government official seeking to build a bridge hears two very different timelines depending on who they call. The Chinese model delivers bulldozers within days of a signed agreement. The Western model delivers environmental impact assessments, procurement processes, compliance reviews, labor standards evaluations, and financing committee votes before anything touches the ground. 3 years later, perhaps a shovel breaks soil. The standards attached to Western financing are often genuinely worth having. Some prevent catastrophes, but in a strategic competition for physical influence, the gap between intention and implementation is a weapon that China exploits without needing to say a word. China has simultaneously moved to consolidate its Eastern Corridor advantage by agreeing to a major revamp of the Tanzania-Zambia Railway, a route linking the Copper Belt to the Indian Ocean coast, which analysts widely read as a direct counterweight to the Lobito project. China is playing simultaneous games across the board. The West is still locating its pieces. Threading through the entire competition for mineral resources is a dimension of the new scramble that receives far less attention than it deserves: the contest for Africa's digital infrastructure. In 2012, China funded the construction and full fit-out of the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, including its internal IT systems. The building was presented as a gift, symbolizing the relationship between Beijing and the continent's primary political institution. Several years later, according to reporting that became widely circulated by 2018, AU technical staff discovered that server activity inside the building was generating substantial data transfers every night between midnight and 2 a.m., when the building was largely empty. Investigators reportedly traced the transfers to external servers in China. The allegation was that confidential AU communications had been exfiltrating for years. China denied the report. The AU publicly dismissed aspects of it, but the AU also, according to the same reporting, subsequently strengthened its cybersecurity posture and replaced equipment. This episode is one building. The larger story is what sits outside it. Huawei has built a substantial portion of Africa's 4G network infrastructure. Estimates from major policy organizations place the figure around 70% of the continent's 4G build-out, with deep involvement in 3G backbone systems as well. The reason is not ideology. It is price, speed, and financing. Huawei bids arrive paired with state-backed loans at rates that Western vendors struggle to match, in timelines that cash-constrained governments find hard to refuse. For a country with enormous connectivity needs and a thin budget, the choice between a $100 million Western proposal and a $60 million Chinese proposal with a friendly loan attached is not complicated. The geopolitical concern that Western governments have raised for years that Chinese-built telecommunications infrastructure creates potential surveillance and control surfaces does not change the budget math for the details buyer, and a network, unlike a mine, is not extracted and shipped away. It grows into the nervous system of a country's economy, governance, and daily life. Replacing it is not a policy preference. It is a billion-dollar undertaking measured in years. The debt dimension of this entire competition came into sharp focus when Zambia became the first African country to default on its sovereign debt in the pandemic era in late 2020. The mechanics were not unique to Zambia. Countries across the continent had borrowed heavily during a period of near-zero global interest rates, funding infrastructure their populations genuinely needed. When the US Federal Reserve began raising rates aggressively to fight inflation, the cost of dollar-denominated debt rose through no fault of the borrowers. Zambia ran out of cash. It went to restructure its obligations and encountered a room that did not follow traditional rules. The IMF and World Bank made their willingness to extend new support conditional on all major creditors accepting proportional losses. China, now one of the continent's largest bilateral lenders, did not operate within the established Paris Club framework. The negotiations stalled. For years, Zambia was frozen, unable to access restructuring support because the creditor room could not reach agreement. Foreign investment dried up, the currency weakened, inflation accelerated. While ambassadors debated debt sustainability frameworks in press releases, nurses in Lusaka went unpaid. The real trap in the debt crisis is rarely confiscation. It is paralysis. When no creditor blinks first, the country stops functioning, and ordinary people absorb the cost. The most consequential development running beneath all of this, however, is the one that disrupts the entire framework of the competition. Africa is not a passive chessboard. It never was. The generation of African leaders navigating this moment have read the history. They understand what the original scramble cost. They understand that single patron dependency committing entirely to one external power is not partnership, but a managed form of subordination. And they have something their predecessors did not: options. When China controls processing and Russia provides security, and the United States offers governance conditions, the holder of the mineral deposit can play these dynamics against each other. Political scientists describe this as active non-alignment, not neutrality but aggressive opportunism, engaging all parties, committing to none, and extracting maximum leverage from a world where every major power simultaneously needs what you have. The DRC demonstrated this capacity concretely. A major minerals for infrastructure agreement signed with Chinese partners in 2008 had, by many analyses, delivered infrastructure at a pace that lagged behind the value of what was being extracted from the ground. The Congolese government took a harder line and pushed for renegotiation. In early 2024, Chinese partners agreed to commit up to $7 billion in infrastructure investment, alongside revised royalty terms. China did not capitulate out of goodwill. It capitulated because cobalt and copper are strategic oxygen for the battery economy, and the DRC is sitting on the tanks. When the prize holds the cards, the terms of the game become negotiable. This agency extends to the demographic reality that no strategic analysis about Africa can afford to ignore. Africa's median age is approximately 19 years old. By mid-century, projections indicate that more than 1 in 4 human beings on Earth will be African. Nigeria alone is projected to surpass the United States in population by around 2050. The rest of the world is aging. Japan's median age approaches 50. Germany's is in the upper 40s. China's working age population is shrinking. Every major economy that depends on labor, which is all of them, will face increasing pressure from a demographic wall. Africa is not facing that wall. Africa is building the workforce that everyone else will need. This creates a fork in the road that will determine whether the new scramble produces a fundamentally different outcome from the original one. If the competition remains purely extractive minerals leave, processing happens elsewhere, jobs do not materialize, debt accumulates, and governance deteriorates, then the demographic wave does not become a dividend. It becomes pressure. Hundreds of millions of connected, educated enough to know what they're missing young people, locked out of the prosperity their land generates, produce political instability that does not stay contained within borders. The migration pressure already visible in European politics is a preview of what structural exclusion at continental scale could produce. And certain external actors have demonstrated both the willingness and the capability to exploit that pressure as a geopolitical instrument, using displacement and instability as leverage against target countries thousands of miles away. But if the competition produces industrialization, if mineral-rich countries succeed in conditioning access on processing, manufacturing, technology transfer, and job creation, then the demographic curve compounds rather than explodes. A rising middle class generates demand. Demand generates scale. Scale generates power. Africa stops being a battlefield and becomes a boardroom. The fork is real. The direction is not yet determined. What is determined is that the outcome will affect every economy on Earth, every supply chain connected to the energy transition, and every person alive today who expects the 21st century to deliver on its technological promises. The minerals do not care about the ideology of the country that extracts them. The batteries do not know whose hands assembled them. The networks do not remember who financed them. But history remembers. And the question that the next 25 years will answer, the one that no infrastructure deal or security guarantee or debt restructuring agreement can settle on its own, is whether the new scramble for Africa ends the same way the original one did, with wealth flowing outward and consequences staying behind, or whether this time the continent finally negotiates a different arrangement. And if the answer depends partly on whether the outside world chooses to engage Africa as a partner, or continues to treat it as a supply chain with a flag, which version do you think we are actually building right now?